Hello, welcome back. In my previous talk, I utilized the case of Deborah Lipstadt to demonstrate how it is that smart, educated, and otherwise normal appearing people can ultimately fall for the most ridiculous conspiracy theories. I emphasized that the current overall climate of relativism and moral inequivalency have tilled the soil and prepared the way for dishonest, manipulative people to sow seeds of doubt, where in reality there shouldn't be any doubt, and that by using benevolent sounding words and confusing terminology and really some good showmanship, they can be quite persuasive in convincing people that there is an other side to the story, which then makes it seem reasonable to engage in an open debate. But in the process, the truth is actually becoming undone. Today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to analyze what strategy we could employ to ensure that we do not fall prey to such tactics. And for this, I just want to turn back to Lipstadt's TED Talks because she gives a little booster to highlight the crucial part of her reasoning.
Time I heard about Holocaust denial, I laughed. Holocaust denial? The Holocaust, which has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. Who could believe it didn't happen? Think about it. For deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Well, first of all, the victims, the survivors, who have told us their harrowing stories. Who else would have to be wrong? The bystanders, the people who lived in the myriads of towns and villages and cities on the Eastern Front, who watched their neighbors be rounded up, men, women, children, young, old, and be marched to the outskirts of the town to be shot and left dead in ditches. Or the Poles, who lived in towns or villages around the death camps, who watched day after day as the trains went in, filled with people, and came out empty. But above all, who would have to be wrong? The perpetrators, the people who say, we did it. I did it. Now, maybe they add a caveat. They say, I didn't have a choice. I was forced to do it. But nonetheless, they said, I did it. Think about it. In not one war crimes trial since the end of World War II has a perpetrator of any nationality ever said it didn't happen.
The technique that she employs is to take her real world and then imagine all the necessary changes and alterations that she would have to make in order for this alternative Holocaust never happened fantasy world to be tenable. So in this case, it would require the cooperation of thousands, if not millions, of witnesses, all of whom come from mixed backgrounds and they have mixed interests. And it would require the reinterpretation of mountains of physical evidence to the point that it becomes logically inconceivable for such a theory to actually be true. This is important because the manipulator slash conspiracist often sells the theory by waving a partially unexplained fact of the story as a distraction. So they usually have one thing that they harp on, while they eventually undermine what was otherwise solid and agreed upon knowledge. In the case of Lipstadt versus Irving, for instance, he harps on the fact that the chimneys could not currently be seen at the supposed Auschwitz gas chamber. He hyper-focuses on that and creates a debate about it, this detail, but eventually he makes the leap that it must be the whole Holocaust was a hoax. As opposed to the much more economical view that maybe the Nazis destroyed the chimneys in order to cover their tracks. A view that would leave the treasure troves of evidence intact. So there are many conspiracies out there, some worse than others, some are anti-Jewish, some are not. In fact, I've found that belief in one conspiracy or another is surprisingly common. I met a guy while on vacation recently, and we were having a conversation. He seemed normal. He seemed very well informed, actually, up until he just dropped this thing on me where he tells me that he thinks George Bush was responsible for conducting 9/11. In other words, America had attacked itself. What would be the motive? Why would America do that, you ask? So that Dick Cheney could make lots of money from the oil that he would eventually steal during the war that America would eventually wage against some innocent country that had nothing to do with it. Proof, simple physics. He claimed that given the structural makeup of the Twin Towers and knowing the maximum heat that could be generated from exploding jet fuel, a crashed airplane alone could not possibly explain or have generated the heat required to collapse the tower. It must be that Bush had also bombed it. Now, I gotta say, I admit, I don't personally know or have the slightest clue about the properties of burning jet fuel or how a high-rise tower is supposed to crumble when an airplane crashes into it. But even if I grant him those points, and I say, okay, you better explain that point, the rest of his version, the alternative universe he's creating, would involve rehashing thousands of facts and thousands of witnesses, all of whom would have had to have been in on it, versus the alternative theory, which is maybe the guy just doesn't know physics. But this approach of keeping track of the big picture, while very useful, does raise a very important question. And that is, what about that like 1 in a million story where the conspiracy just happens to actually be true? Isn't it possible that for this or that particular story, it just so happens that there really was a thing where everybody happened to have been in on it, and as unlikely as it is, that was the truth? In that case, if we utilize this method of reasoning, wouldn't we all miss the boat? So I actually want to use an example as a case in point. I want to point us towards the story of the White Rose. So here I've been doing a little bit of research. You can see some of my reading. Really cool story. This is the story of the tiny bud of German resistance that existed against Nazism during the Holocaust. The story is so incredible, and it's so pertinent to the discussion, specifically because of the way this thing went down. When I think of a resistance or resistance fighters, I usually conjure up an image of guys with like bandanas around their face, hiding out on the ground, with a secret cache of stolen guns and hand grenades, and maybe there's one bazooka. Or I could think of like political activists or extreme pacifists who chain themselves up to trees or something. But this is the story of a couple university students who just refused to listen to the teachings of their professors. And they went against what was the common sense that was all around them. And they disregarded everything their friends were telling them. And they also ignored the constant propaganda that the Nazis were pumping through all the media. That's the story of the White Rose. So this group, they called themselves the White Rose. It began in the University of Munich, which was Hitler's prized city where his movement began. And it was started by a 20-something-year-old medical student named Hans Scholl. He started this thing. He ended up being joined by his younger sister, who was an undergrad at University of Munich, and a few of his med student friends. And eventually, a little later on, he was joined by one single professor who spoke up. One of his philosophy professor. His name was Kurt Huber. Now, before I continue, it's important for me to explain what kind of battle they were up against. The battle that the average German citizen had to face, knowingly or otherwise, it was not physical. This was an intellectual, spiritual, and psychological war. In order to really appreciate the White Rose, I really need to paint the contrast, the blackness of the atmosphere of the background that was going on. Hitler had strategically and purposefully attacked the minds of the German youth, first of all, by cutting off the main sources of intellectual and spiritual sustenance. He started, big thing was called the Hitler Youth Camps, with programs to get eager children into Nazi uniform quickly, and they were all indoctrinated to believe in the greatness of Hitler. Educational changes like this extended up through school, up through the university level, where all the Jewish professors, by law, were thrown out. Anybody with non-Nazi political affiliations expelled. And the curricula were also tightly regulated, even in subjects of like science and math, where so-called Jewish theories or communist theories, like for instance Einstein's theory of relativity, was not allowed to be taught. Any person in general walking the streets, anybody could be killed for saying the wrong thing or looking the wrong way at somebody. And there were plenty of people who couldn't wait to rat on you or snitch because they were just so scared for themselves. They wanted to build street cred with the Gestapo. So what's happening is there's a high level of ambient terror that hangs in there. Everyone is scared out of their brains. For the majority of young adults who grew up in this type of atmosphere, Nazism was hardwired into their brains. This is all they knew. They would have heard nothing else during those years. So Hitler's strategy, by design, was to manipulate and lie to the people in order to maintain popular control. This is spelled out in his book Mein Kampf. On principle, he was anti-intellectual, anti-arts. He portrayed scholarship and arts as being signs of weakness and signs of effeteness. By the time Hans Scholl was ready to begin his resistance, consider this, he had already religiously attended the Hitler Youth, where he became a group leader. He was good at it. He had already served in the Nazi army. He was a medic, and now he's in the University of Munich, where school military exercises are the norm, where the professors are singing Hitler's praise, and where most students were enthusiastic and active Nazi supporters. To be a resistor in this atmosphere is an intellectual, moral, spiritual challenge of the highest magnitude, and it's also terrifyingly dangerous. The point that I need to make here is that for Hans Scholl to be right, he had to believe that all his professors were wrong, all the other students were wrong, all the camp counselors wrong, his army superiors and colleagues were wrong, and all the radio and newspaper stuff that he was hearing, that was all wrong. He basically had to believe he was right and everybody else was wrong. And it's like, it's the equivalent today of somebody believing the earth is flat or Elvis is alive. And he had to believe it with enough conviction and enough guts to stake his life on it. Okay, so what did they do? So Scholl and his crew, they rented a nearby art studio and they secretly purchased a typewriter. And they wrote up anti-Nazi and anti-Hitler newsletters. They didn't have copy machines back then, so they had to buy stencils, and they used a crank-operated mimeograph machine. So somebody for each copy had to actually pound out the paper, one at a time. They then would strategically disseminated these papers all over Germany, and even into some other places like Austria. This was the first time in the history of the Third Reich that there was such an open opposition to Nazism. This was it. At that point in time, what they did was completely unheard of. It was unprecedented. It was shocking. And it drove the Nazis absolutely crazy. It drove them nuts because this was a challenge to their maintenance of control, of thought control. Word of this resistance went up to the highest echelons of the party. They had no idea how many people were involved, if it was a whole army of resistance or just 6 kids like this was. But for the common German, these papers would have been proof that there were people who believed in an alternative version of what's going on, of a non-Nazi version of the truth. The seriousness of this act of defiance and outward expression is made very clear by how the Nazis reacted to it, which was in full force. Eventually, the Scholl siblings were caught when they took a bunch of their papers, a stack of them. They went to the University of Munich, the hall, and they chucked them over the balcony so all the papers would come down. Someone saw them doing it, and they arrested them. After a couple days they were interrogated. The Nazis flew in, especially a judge named Roland Freisler from Berlin. This was the chief judge of the People's Court, and he was known for his cruelty and for dishing out the highest punishments for like big treason type of cases. And they conducted a parody of a court case to a packed house. So the place was packed with uniformed Nazis. Everybody wanted to see this for themselves. And the judge eventually found them guilty of high treason and guilty of attempting to destroy the National Socialist way of life. Thought control was such an integral part of what the Nazis were doing that they legitimately felt that these few college kids were an existential threat. Also, the Nazis were totally shocked that these youths from within their own program of indoctrination had come up through the system and were still capable of thinking this way. It was so surprising to them. Now, sadly, all these kids had their heads chopped off by guillotine. That was the punishment. So how are a bunch of college kids capable of carrying this program out? Where did they come from? I want a little background. So what I found is that all the members of the White Rose group, each of them, they were all raised in an environment with educated parents and parents that fostered an environment of open thought and opinion. They were exposed from early age to literature, poetry, philosophy, and the arts, in addition to the normal stuff that kids do, running around outside and everything. This was also stuff that they did on their free time. They enjoyed it. They liked to read. They would discuss books. They had like book groups with their friends. They would go out and to see shows of different kinds. By the time they were in college, they were familiar with the works of classical philosophy. They knew political theory. The ones that were religious, like the Scholls, they had already had like personal exploration into the works of Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas Aquinas. When the Nazis tried to ban and label books as being poisonous or art as being degenerate art, these kids wouldn't buy it. They had put serious thought into their beliefs, and they maintained a sense of spiritual and intellectual independence and even sort of rebelliousness. All these characteristics really come through gorgeously in the newsletters they produced. They called out Hitler for the evil, lying demon that he was. They called out Nazism for the destructive, oppressive, and evil movement that it was. And they called out all the German citizens for standing by apathetically. They really wanted to weigh in on the conscience of the people to prevent them from being able to sleep at night. Famously, they wrote that all the Germans are guilty, guilty, guilty. They drew upon multiple literary sources to support their claims, and it's all highly impressive, but too much for me to read through here. What's even more amazing is the way that the youngsters handled themselves after they were caught. They never lost their composure. They never lost their nerve. They wouldn't recant anything that they said, and they actually individually took full credit for what they had done because they didn't want the Nazis looking for any of their other friends. They wanted to just take it down with them. While they were in jail before they got killed, they actually wrote letters, Hans and Sophie School, and they wrote, and I quote, they were sure the future would justify them. During their mock trials, Sophie shocked everyone by standing up to this bloodthirsty judge and telling him, "You know the war is lost. Why don't you have the courage to face it?" Which shocked the whole bench. Hans also added these words that today they're hanging us, but tomorrow it will be your turn. And even the executioner was impressed with how cool the Scholls were. When Professor Huber's turn came up, he had his court case a little while afterwards, and he was also beheaded. He had the following to say to the judge. He said that his whole goal was to call out the truth as clearly and as audibly as possible into the German night. And with that, I come back to my original question from the beginning, which is, what are we supposed to do to avoid having these wrong beliefs? And the key to sifting through what's real and what's conspiracy, then here's the big secret. It sounds obvious, but the key is to keep the goal of truth at the forefront of your mind. So you need to know and even remind yourself, if necessary, that you're searching first and foremost for the truth of the matter, if that has to be your goal. This is not self-evident. I see it all the time, like in different contexts where in universities or religious gatherings, it's not a consideration. So people want to hear stories, people want to feel good. What something actually means or what actually happened is like, it's a moot point. The biggest step to staying true is actually to be clear about the fact that you want the truth. And I have a story, an anecdotal story about this. I randomly met someone named Laura Dubois. She is a producer, and she produced a documentary called Active Measures. It's on Amazon. It has a 5-star rating with hundreds of reviews. It's a political documentary. And she explained to me that it's all about the Russia-Trump scandal. And actually it features interviews with Hillary Clinton and John Podesta and John McCain. So she must have been involved with some very powerful people. She was very proud of the fact that her documentary was being used at very prestigious universities as part of their coursework. They were showing it at Yale and some other places that she mentioned. And she thought her documentary was like super, super awesome, super important. Now I thought about it. I said, okay, I think that documentaries really could be very important, but I just had one question. When you went out and decided you wanted to do this documentary, what was your goal? And like in a snap, she said, I know, my goal It was to save democracy. And I knew right on the spot that that was the wrong answer. All I wanted to hear was just one word: truth.